Welcome, everybody. Today's Daf, Be'ezras Hashem, is Masechta Menachos Daf Chof Hey, number 25. And we're starting from the Mishnah directly on Daf Chof Hey, the top of the Mishnah. And the Mishnah is describing very easy. There is something that the Kohen Gadol wore every day called the tzitz. As you can see in the picture, the tzitz was like a headband that said Kodesh Lashem, a gold plate worn on the Kohen Gadol's forehead that said Kodesh Lashem. What was interesting about this tzitz is that when the Kohen Gadol wore it, there are certain averas within a carbon that the tzitz said that the carbon is accepted. You see, because the Kohen Gadol was wearing this tzitz, a certain avera, if the carbon was done wrong, the carbon nevertheless it's affected the acceptance of the carbon, and that it's still okay, only because the Kohen Gadol is wearing the tzitz. So, for example, look at the Heilige Mishnah, Nitma HaKoimitz. If the koimitz, the kmitza that you're supposed to be makrav on the mizbeach, right? This kmitza that the Kohen Gadol is supposed to be makrav on the mizbeach for a person that brought a carbon mincha. If that became tamei, the krivoy, and the Kohen, despite being tamei, he was makrav it on the mizbeach, a tamei koimitz. Hatzitz mizratza, the tzitz affected acceptance, and therefore you could eat the rest of the mincha. It's a kosher mincha, and the bailam does not have to bring another mincha. But however, yotza, let's say the koimitz left the Beis Hamikdash. Oh, once something leaves the Beis Hamikdash, it's also pasul. And then the kriva, and then the kohen brought it back into the Beis Hamikdash and brought it onto the mizbeach, was makravit. Ein hatzitz miratza. Then it doesn't work. The tzitz doesn't effectuate an acceptance. Shatzitz miratza ala tomei be'enei miratza ala yotzi. So tzitz can only effectuate acceptance only if something is tomei. Then it lets it slide. But the tzitz does not bring forgiveness. Let's say for something that is yotze. That's something that left the Beis Hamikdash. Tana Rabbanan. Let's learn the brisa. V'nosa aharon esavoyin k'hakodeshim. Torah tells you when Aaron HaKohen, the Gadol, wears the tzitz, he's carrying the burden of the averis that the Jewish people do when it concerns karbonos. So when he wears this, he's carrying the burden of any aver of kachim, and he brings about atonement. Which avera does the Kohen Gadol allow to slide? If it's talking about, let's say, a person shechted a carbon with a bad thought of chutzlim kaimai, so there's no way that you could sprinkle the blood on the mizbeach, because there the Torah says lo yechashiv. No matter what's going to happen, a pigul carbon is not acceptable. In time avoy noiser, let's say it was an avera of chutz lizmanoi. Would the tzitz effectuate acceptance? Harei kranema, the pasuk says lo yeratza. That again, Hashem doesn't accept such a carbon. Ha'eina noiser, so what's left? It doesn't effectuate acceptance el avoin tuma, only if there's a tuma involved. Why? Because tuma, we find that tuma was a lighter type of avera, and only a lighter type of avera, that's what the tzitz was maratza. How do you know a tuma is a lighter type of avera? Shehutra la'meklali b'tzibur. Because let's say the entire tzibur was tamei, or the kahanim were tamei, all the kayan, so you brought a carbon tamei, because it says in the pasuk b'mayadoi afilu b'tuma. So automatically hutra was permitted when the tzibur is tamei. So we see tuma being makrav b'tuma is a lighter type of avera, and because of that, therefore, when we say that the tzitz is maratza, it's going to maratza on a carbon yochid that has a tuma on it. So if the kamitza got tamei and the kohen didn't know or on purpose put it onto the mizbeach, so then the tzitz is maratza and the carbon mincha is kosher. Maskef lo Rab Zeres, or Rab Zeres ask, Ema, maybe the tzitz brings about an acceptance of Oin Yaitse. Let's say the blood left the base of Migdash. You took the blood and you walked out of the base of Migdash. Now you brought it back in and brought it on Mizbeach. Maybe the tzitz says that it's okay. Why? We see that they during the time when there was no base of Migdash and you were allowed to have your own personal Mizbeach, you were makriv outside the base of Migdash on a bama. So maybe the tzitz was maratza on that. Amalei Abaya, Amakra, because the pasuk says, "L'ratzin lahem lifnei Hashem." Avain de lifnei Hashem in Avain de Yotzilai. So the Torah tells you that the tzitz was maratza only for an avera, and it brings about an acceptance only for an avera that was done in the base of Migdash, which is tuma. That's an avera that's done in the base of Migdash, but an avera that is done by taking the blood outside the base of Migdash and then bringing it back in, that tzitz is not going to say it's acceptable. So maskif la Rabbi Eloi. So Rabbi Eloi asked the question, Ema, let us say that tzitz brings about an acceptance for another type of avera. Avoin small. If b'di'eved, the kohen did the service with his left hand, let's say he threw the kamitza onto the mizbeach with his left hand, we'll say it's okay. Because we find that the kohen did use his left hand on Yom Kippur. And during Yom Kippur, the kohen gadol at one point had to carry in his right hand a shovel, and in his left hand he carried the incense. So we see it's a lighter type of avera, carrying with the left hand. Amalei Abaya, Amakra Avay, but the Torah says it's an avera, and carrying with the left hand on Yom Kippur is not an avera. Avay shahaya by udchisiv. We find if you find an avera that's pushed away, that's the type of avera. That's the type of avera that tzitz will effectuate acceptance. La puke Yom HaKippurim the hechsher b'smailehu. Yom Kippur is not when you carry in your left hand on Yom Kippur. That's not an avera. That's because that's the way to do the service on Yom Kippur. So therefore, the pasuk that says that the tzitz is maratza on something is not talking about you did the service with your left hand. Ravashi says, I have another pasuk, avoin kadoshim, that the tzitz is maratza only on a sin in the korban itself, in the mincha itself, loy avoin hamakdishim, but not in the person that's bringing the korban, which is the kohen. So it's not maratza on an avera that the kohen's doing, but rather an avera that is done with the korban itself. Bottom line is that we're just substantiating what it says in the Mishnah. What does it say in the Mishnah? Nitma hakoimitz, if the koimitz became tamei, the kriva, and you threw it on the mizbeach anyway, hatzitz maratza, the tzitz says it's okay. It effectuated an acceptance, and if you burn the koimitz, you could eat the shirayim of the carbon. Amalei Rav Simi B'rei Rav Idi Rav Ashi. Amri law, another say Rav Sima B'rei Rav Ashi. So somebody said to Rav Ashi, and Rav Sima said to Rav Ashi, but we don't know who Rav Sima's father was. Either he's Rav Sima, the son of Rav Idi, or he's Rav Sina, the son of Rav Ashi. He said to his father, Rav Ashi. And the question was, maybe the tzitz is maratza ve'ema avoin balmum. Maybe the tzitz is maratza when the animal has a blemish on it. If you makriv an animal that had a carbon that had a blemish, but the guy should be yaitza. How do we know that balmum? Where else do we find the balmum is a lighter type of avera? Because we see that the Torah wasn't so makbid on balmum. Shehut miklole ba'ofis. It's exempt by the general rule by birds. Birds, there's no such a thing of a balmum. There's only if it's missing a limb, but if it's a balmum, if it's a broken leg, you could still use it as a bird. The Amamar, because we learned, Tamas v'zachros b'behema, you need to have it no balmum, and it should be male by an animal. In Tamas v'zachros by birds, we don't have this concept of male, female, and we don't have this concept of balmum. So we see birds, so we see that balmum is a type of avera within a carbon. Perhaps the tzitz would effectuate acceptance if someone brought a carbon that's a balmum. Amalei, so Rav Ashi told his son, or told Rav Sima, Alecha makra, for you the pasuk said, Lo yeratzeh. that says kol mum kol ashaboy mum loisekruvo ki loileratzoin yira lechem. Loileratzoin yira lechem means that no matter what, Hashem will never accept a carbon that has a bal mum. So ends the sugya, and now the Gemara continues. Gemara continues in the bottom of Chafei Amar Aleph, Taner Rabbanon. Dam shenitba uzrake. The dam, the blood that became tamei, and you sprinkled it on the mizbeach. The kohen went ahead and sprinkled it on the mizbeach. So b'shaygik, if he did it by mistake, he didn't know it was tamei. Hurtza, the carbon is kosher. The nezid, if he knew it was tamei, and he went ahead and sprinkled it on the mizbeach, loy hurtza, the carbon is not acceptable. That's what the Brisa says. So the key here is b'mezid loy hurtza, because with the tzitz probably is not going to effectuate an acceptance if you purposely sprinkle the blood on the mizbeach, knowing that the blood is tamei. Says the Gemara, only if it's a private carbon, individual's carbon. If it's a carbon sibor, doesn't matter. Whether the kohen knew the blood was tamei or not, the tzibur was yotzeh the carbon. Ubagoy. And what happens, a goy is makar of a carbon? We know from Psukim that a goy could send a carbon and being makar in the base of Mikdash, and it's the goy's carbon. And let's say that blood became tamei. So then, no matter what, the goy was not yotzei. Why? Because bein b'shaygig, bein b'mezid, bein b'inus, bein b'ratzin. Inus is the same, almost is different than shaygig. Somebody put a gun to the kohen and told him sprinkle the blood on the mizbeach, or he did it by mistake, or the kohen did it on purpose and sprinkled the blood on the mizbeach. No matter what, if it's a goy's carbon, we go to Amid Beis, lo hurtza, so it doesn't effectuate. It's not acceptable. So now says the Gemara. So what do we see from here? That a mistaken carbon is if it was done on purpose, then it's loy hurtza. It's not acceptable. Uraminhu, I'll ask you a contradiction. The pasuk, the Brisa says, "Alma hatzitz meratza." What does it sits bring about acceptance? Al adam, on blood that became tamei, and you sprinkled it on the mizbeach. Or valabasa valchelev shenivah. Let's say before they sprinkled the blood did not become tamei. Blood's in a cup, but the meat and the fats became tamei. And then you sprinkle the blood on the mizbeach. So no matter what, bein b'shaygig, bein b'mezid, whether you knew it became tamei when on purpose, or you did it on purpose, the blood you knew it was tamei and you sprinkled it on the mizbeach. And here's the key: bein b'inus, bein b'ratzin, bein b'yachid, bein b'tzibah. No matter what, the tzitz says it's acceptable. So here's the contradiction. First Brisa number 1 said that b'mezid loy hurtza. It's not acceptable. And Brisa number 2 says that if you sprinkle the tamei blood on purpose, the tzitz will say it's a kosher carbon. So how do you resolve that? Amar Rav Yosef like kasha, it's not difficulty. Rav Yosef harabanim, depends. It's a machlekes. The Tanya we learned in a Brisa, ein taimim, ein taimim min atame al hatar. One is not allowed to take off truma from apples. Let's take a look at the picture. The guy's taking off them. You have apples that are tamei, fruits that are tamei, and you're taking off the truma on behalf of the tar. The reason is simple, because if you're going to give the kohen the tamei fruits, what's he going to do with it? He can't eat it. It's tamei truma. You're giving him tamei truma right away, so he can only burn it. So you're not supposed to do that. If you by mistake took the truma from the tamei on behalf of the tar, if you did it by mistake, truma, then the truma is good. B'mezid, if you did it on purpose, then the chachamim can ask you, ain't truma say truma. Your truma is not a good truma. So that fits like Brisa number 1. If you do something on purpose, if you do something by mistake, you can say that the tzitz says it's acceptable. But if you do it on purpose, the kohen put it on the mizbeach, the tamei blood on the mizbeach, then it's not going to work. Just like if you tire him from tamei to tar, b'mezid, the truma is not a good truma. So that would be Brisa number 1. Rabbi Yossi says he'll say like Brisa number 2. Bein b'shoygig, bein b'mezid, truma si truma. He said that the chachamim would never knasing you, and even if you took off truma from tamei al hatar, You took from fruits that are tamei on behalf of tevel that's tahar. Truma say truma, the truma is truma. Even though you know you're doing something wrong, same thing. If you sprinkle the tamei blood on the mizbeach, knowing that it's tamei, the carbon is kosher. Says the Gemara. So you want to say that brisa number 2 is Rabbi Yossi? I'll say not so. Rabbi Yossi says, but the evidence it's okay. From that truma, it's a good. There's no knas. You don't have to take off truma again. The meratzah, and therefore it's good. The meratzah sits ala chilos mishamatay. Here, made it. Wait a second. But when in the second case of the brisa says, what happens if the basar is tamei, right? The basar is tamei. Let's say the meat is tamei, and the dam is tar, right? So where do you find that Rabbi Yossi holds that the tzitz would be miratza if the meat became tamei and the blood is tar? That you don't see. In fact, you see the opposite. But Tanya, we learned to the brisa, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer says that it's maratza al-chilas. That b'diavad, if you sprinkle blood tahar, although the meat is tamei, the guy was yaitzi the carbon. And Rabbi Yossi says, "Ein atzitz maratza al-chilas." The tzitz would not bring about atonement if the basar became tamei. If the blood is tar, you sprinkle down the mizbeach, but the basar was tamei prior to that, it doesn't say it's a good carbon. And this brisa seems to say that it would be a good carbon. So how can you say the author of the brisa number 2 is Rabbi Yossi? And says the Gemara Eipach, you turn around the opinions. Rabbi Yossi is the one that says that the tzitz could bring about an atonement even if the basar is tamei. So Rabbi Yossi could be the author of the brisa if you switch it around. Now, the Gemara is going to ask a little long question and say this is not a good teretz. And the Gemara is going to have to come up with another 3 terutzim for the answer, the stiras of brises. Maskif lo Rav Sheshes. Rav Sheshes asked the question, Umi matzah afchazle. How can you say that Rabbi Lezer holds ein hatzitz maratza al achilas? That tzitz would not be maratza if the basar is tamei, because that's what you have to say. You're switching it around. Rabbi Lezer was the one that said that if the dam is tar and the basar is tamei, the tzitz is not going to say it's a good carbon. How could you say that? This brisa that I'm going to show you, the only person that can be the author of this brisa for a different reason is Rabbi Lezer, and this brisa says that the tzitz is maratza al achilas. So Rabbi Lezer was the one that says tzitz maratza achilas, and not Rabbi Yossi. How do you know that? Because how do I know this brisa? The following brisa is authored by Rabbi Lezer. So we know the brisa is discussing the idea of someone who is a tamei. If you're a tamei, you're not allowed to eat carbon meat, right? Now, what happens if you do? A person gets karetz. So Raisa says, Yochel, I would have thought, Basar shenitma lifnei zrikas damim, yehei chayaven aleim shum tuma. Let's say the basar became tamei before you sprinkle the blood, right? And then you sprinkle the blood, right? I would have thought that if someone who is a tamei and eats that meat, right? Eat that meat, he's chayav kares, because that's not normal carbon meat. Because as soon as you sprinkle the blood, it is still the meat was never a carbon meat, because you can never have eaten that meat because the basar became tamei before the zrikas dam. So I would think you would be chayav kares. Talmud Loime kol tar yoichal basam anesef ashtoichal basam mizevach Hashem Hashem v'tumasay alav v'nechrasa. Here the pasuk clearly says that if you have a tumah and you eat carbon meat, you get kares. But the Torah says kol tar yoichal basar. So we darshan hanitar lata'orim chayavel mishum tumah. If it was permitted for tahorim to eat that meat, and you're a tamei and eat that meat, like regular carbon meat, then you get karas. But even if a tar could not eat that meat, so then if a tamei eats that meat, then you would not be mechayev karas. So even a tar could not eat basa that became tamei lifnei zrikas dam. So therefore, that's not included in the isser of eating carbon meat, the tumah. Oy einoi, or not so. Ella nechal the tarim chayav mishum tumah. which ain't a nechel tyrant, ain't chayav and mishum tuma. And now I'm going to say, oh, if that's the case, if you're so pedantic about it and say that the only time you chayiv chorus for eating a tummy person eating carbon meat is only if a tar can eat the meat right now, then if a tummy eats it, he gets chorus. But what happens if this was a carbon meat, but now it's puzzle because either it's over the time limit passed, so it's like noisar, or it left the base of Migdash. It was a chatas and it left the base of Migdash or left Yerushalayim, where a Torah person can't eat that meat. How do I know that if a Tameh person would eat that meat, he would be chayav kares? Talmud loy ma'asher Hashem riba. There's an inclusion that includes this. Okay, so a carbon, even though right now a Torah can't eat it, probably at one time a Torah could have eaten it, so therefore it's included in the Isser of a tummy not eating it. So it says, I might think that a marba including pigel and noisar, that noisar, a tummy eats noisar, he gets an avera. Wait a second, noisar is hani lon. We already said that lon, you get the avera of tummy eating meat that's noisar. Ella, I might think pigulim kenoisaris. I will think that pigel is like noisar, just like noisar. If a tummy person eats it, he gets kares. So also, if a tummy person eats pigel, he also gets the kares because he's tummy. Meat, it's an exception. Only if it's kosher shlomim, not pigel shlomim. So now, you're telling me that a tummy person that eats, it depends. If he eats noisar meat, then the tummy person gets kares. He's a tummy person eating nicer meat, he gets kares. But if he ate pigel meat, if he ate pigel meat of a carbon, he doesn't get kares. Why? The Torah says one you get kares and one you don't get kares. Amrit, I'm going to say marbani is elu shoyselem shasa kosher. A nicer meat at one time, a Torah could have eaten that meat. So therefore, if now you can't eat it, but since at one time you could have eaten, if a tummy eats that meat, that he gets karetz. I'm going to exclude the pigel meat that never was kosher. Right when you shechted and you had a pigel thought, the meat was tameh. You couldn't eat the meat. The im timer. If that's the case, if shaloi, here's where we're going to say the im timer. Why is it that basa that became tameh before the zrikas dam? So it never had a shasa kosher. It never was permitted for a tar to eat it, and yet after the zrikas damim, if a tameh person eats that meat, he gets kares. Why? That meat was never kosher for a regular person to eat. So the Brisa says, you're right, but the tzitz maratza, the tzitz says that we treat it that the guy was yoytz to the carbon. So if the guy was yoytz to the carbon, so it's considered as if the person that had that meat had a shasa kosher, it was permitted, and therefore if a tamei person would eat that meat, he would get kares. Nitme'en, only if the tamei, if the meat became tamei, yoytzi loy. But if he took it out, even if you sprinkled the blood on the mizbeach, the tzitz will not be maratza. And man shamat le dama ein zrika may elis liyoytzi Rab Leza ukatani de maratza tzitz alachilos. So you have to take there's a opinion of Rab Leza in Me'ila that says the tzitz would be maratza if the meat became tamei and you sprinkled the blood. What happens if you took the meat outside the base of Mikdash and sprinkled the blood? Rab Leza says that tzitz doesn't effectuate. It doesn't make it a kosher carbon. So who's that? So the author of this brisa is definitely Rab Leza. And Rab Leza says in this brisa that the tzitz would be maratza on meat that became tamei, the tzitz would be maratza. So we see from there that the Rab Leza was the one that said, Rab Leza, whether it says that tzitz is maratza alachilis, it must be. Rab Yossi said, ain't it tzitz maratza alachilis? So you can't say the author of the second brisa is Rab Yossi. Ella Amar Rav Chizda. Let's go back to the Gemara. Another 2 more minutes, and then we'll stop. Basically, we have a Stiris Brisa. One Brisa says that if the dam became tamei and the kohen b'mezid sprinkled it on the mizbeach, it sits as not maratza. And the second brisa says that sits would be maratza. Like kasha, it's not. Rav Chizda gives a new teretz. Like kasha, Rab Lezer, Rabbanan. The Rab Lezer says it's maratza, and the Rabbanan say that b'mezid it's not maratza. Ema the shamet le Rab Lezer maratza sits al chilas. The loy konis mi shamet le. Where do we find that Reb Lezer will hold that they didn't knas a person? Maybe Reb Lezer holds that if on purpose you went and sprinkled tummy blood on the mizbeach, Reb Lezer will hold that the tzitz is not maratze. And says Gemara, and the Tanya we learned in the Brisa, that Reb Lezer said that when you separate tummy on tahar, when you separate Tameh and Tahar, Truma, b'mezid, it's still good. So Reb Lezer is not into punishing people. So therefore, the second brisa must go according to Reb Lezer. So the Gemara asks, how do you know? Maybe Reb Lezer only said that you don't knas a person only if he did it b'mezid, only by truma, which is slighter. By kachim, if a kohen went b'mezid, took blood and sprinkled it on the mizbeach, maybe Reb Lezer would hold that the carbon is not kosher. Says Gemara says in kain ha'aman tramei. Then how are you going to answer who's the author of the second brisa? So if we're going to try to find somebody that's the author of the second brisa, it must be Rabbi Eliezer. Then Ravina says. We messed up interpreting the brisa. Ravina Amar says to Masai bein b'shaygid bein b'mezid hurtza. The brisa is saying that when b'shaygid b'mezid, the brisa is not talking about you sprinkled it b'mezid on the mizbeah. It's only talking how did the blood became tamei. If it doesn't matter if the blood became tamei b'shaygid or the blood became tamei b'mezid. Only if you sprinkle it b'shoigig hurtza, b'mezid loy hurtza. If you sprinkle it b'shoigig, it's hurtza, and b'mezid loy hurtza. So the both prices agree with each other. On purpose, if the kohen sprinkles it on the mizbeach, it's loy hurtza, only b'shoigig. But what the second price is talking about, not that the kohen is sprinkling it, even it's how the blood became tamei. There, it doesn't matter how the blood became tamei, whether someone was actually metamei on purpose or not. The blood is still has a way to, if you mix it onto the mizbeach, it could work. Rav Shela says, the opposite. Bein b'shoigeg bein b'mezid hortza, to masai b'shoigeg hortza b'mezid loy hortza. He says, no, you read it the opposite. If the kohen sprinkled it on the mizbeach on purpose, tamei blood, it's fine. But it depends how the blood became tamei. If the blood became tamei b'shoigig, then it's hortza. B'mezid loy hortza. But if someone was matama the blood on purpose, then it doesn't work. We'll end over here. But the brisa number 2 says that the blood became tamei bein b'shoigig bein b'mezid. And according to Rav Shela, you have to read the brisa somewhat differently, because according to the brisa, if you purposely were matamid the blood, then it doesn't work. So answers the Gemara. This is how Rav Shela would read the second brisa. Nitma b'shoigig, if it became tamei b'shoigig, and uzroke bein b'shoigig bein b'mezid, and you sprinkled it, and the kohen sprinkled it even on purpose, it's hortza. But it all depends how the blood became tamei. If the blood became tamei b'shoigig, then everything could be okay. But if someone was matama the blood on purpose, then that's not going to be okay. And this is how we answer up the brises so they jive with each other. Okay, we'll stop over here. Let's just finish up the Gemara Chavav Tashma coming here. Dam should nitma uzrakai b'shoigig hurtza b'mezid loy hurtza. So this might be a question against Rab Shela. Rab Shela's opinion is that the brisa, it depends how the blood became tamei. If it became tamei because you became tamei on purpose, then it's not hurtza. And it's the zrika, it doesn't matter what the zrika is. But here, a brisa says, dam that became tame, and you sprinkled it, b'shoigig hurtza, b'mezid loy hurtza. According to Rav Sheila, b'mezid is also hurtza. It's only a question how the blood became tame. So how do you read this brisa? And it says the Gemara, this is how Rav Sheila would read this brisa. Dam shenitma uzrakai. Dam that became tame. Uzrakai, bein b'shoigig, bein b'mezid, then then it depends. If it's nitba b'shoigig hurtza, b'mezid loy hurtza. So b'shoigig hurtza is going back on the dam. How did the dam become tame? If the dam became tame b'shoigig, then it doesn't matter how you sprinkled it, it would be hurtza. But if the dam became tame b'mezid, somebody purposely mismatama the blood, then it would be loy hurtza. Okay, so that's how Rav Sheila learns these two brises, and therefore it's not a steer anymore. Okay, good Shabbos.